All right.
Hello, everyone. This is Kurt Doolittle from the Natural Law Institute. I'm here with my friend and author Luke Weinhagen to discuss his book, The Primal Primer. We're getting into chapter 13 of 16 chapters, right? So we'll tell you how to get to that in the below, etc. So I don't think at this point, should I have to remind the audience what we're doing, or you think they're caught up? Normally I start out with Luke's got this book. It has two basic paths to it: situational awareness and fieldcraft. And he alternates the chapters, so to speak, to make you a fully whole person, able to be self-sufficient in reality and therefore have the mindfulness of it. So I think I've restated that mission every time by now. So if the previous 12 didn't stick, it's probably hopeless. So what do you
Anyone jumping in at this specific chapter is probably someone that's got this stuff nailed already. So
all right. So what do you want to get across in chapter 13 of the Primal Primer?
So chapter 13 is about hygiene. The chapter title is Hygiene, the Business of Doing Your Business. Right. And so we get into a lot here.
Is this going to upset me? Is this chapter? It's either going to be comedic or revolting.
Oh, well, it's going to be comedic both? in its revulsion.
Okay. So because it's not obvious how important this is, right?
Right. Yes. Unfortunately, yes. Yeah.
So go ahead and tell us what you're trying to get across here and why.
So just to frame it accurately, right? A lot of the stuff I talk about it deals with identifying threats or responding to threats, or identifying opportunities, responding to opportunities, right? It's just about paying attention to our environments and what our environments present to us, and resources that are available in our environment, stuff like that, right? So, but just for framing purposes, right, the most common physical threat that most people face, like in general, it's not one that people think about a lot. It's falling. That's the most common physical threat, in altercation with the ground, right? And that can take you out as easily as an attacker can take you out, right? If you fall and break a leg or hurt your hip or whatever, I mean, you're injured just as you would be if you had been violently attacked, right? So this one becomes important because the second most common physical threat, and sometimes the first, but the second most common physical threat we face is an altercation with a pathogen, right? And that's what we're talking about here today in a large ways, right? And pathogens, are the bacterias, the viruses, the fungus, the things like that, the things that compromise your system, right? I think that an argument can be made now with recent events that some of this external introduction of RNA could be considered or could be categorized as pathogenic, right? So we're expanding the pathogens that we're being exposed to, right? But in response to that, we need to develop hygiene, right? Poor hygiene is the pathway of the pathogen. Right. So that's why we're talking about it today, right? So that's kind of the big thrust in
so
the hygiene chapter.
Couldn't you have said defense against pathogens instead of hygiene?
Right.
It's
yeah.
I'm just teasing. I'm teasing. I gotta tease him. So I'm just because that whole hygiene thing, it just reminds me. I'm just thinking of shampoo and soap and whatever. Yeah. But what it comes to, because one of the books that informed me early was called Plagues and Peoples.
Right.
And that book is terrifying because we've since 1900, we had this whole cleanliness thing, right?
Right.
Why? Yes. Tuberculosis, and what was the other one? No, it's mostly tuberculosis, right? So we had that. So that's why we have running water in America, and the rest of the world doesn't, right? I mean, it didn't, right? We have running water, and we have all this cleanliness and soap and stuff, right? And although I got to tell you, it used to be girls wash their hair once in a while, and that was the girls' favorite excuse that they're not to go out with you because they had to wash their hair, but. That's true. I'm old enough to remember it, believe it or not. But then we got the blow dryer thing, and all of a sudden they lost their excuse. So they had to come up with more stuff. Anyway, so
you make an interesting point there though, because we've become so accustomed to practices of hygiene that we've blurred the line between hygiene and grooming. That's right. And we've made them synonymous with each other. And what I'm talking about in this chapter specifically is less about grooming. I'm not going to teach you how to comb your hair in the wild, right? But I am going to teach you hygiene, how to defend yourself against the introduction of pathogens is basically the primary point of this, right? Anything that we talked in the past, we talked about things like cordage and fire and things. Those are force multipliers for your survival, right? Pathogens are the opposite. They have the opposite effect. They're like force underminers. They're force
Yes.
compromisers, right? They may not be the thing that takes you out directly, but if you are bent over double because your stomach hurts so bad and you can't move without crapping yourself, you're not going to go get food and water. You're not going to defend yourself against an attacker, right? So these pathogens, they can really compromise your ability to maintain your own survival in any environment, even in our modern environments. Right? You spend any time in a country that hasn't, you know, met Western levels of cleanliness, you can find out real quick that these pathogens are still a very real threat to you, even when you assume yourself to be in modern situations. The chapter specifically, I start this chapter off with a story about my first experience of a public restroom in Japan. Now, when I was there, a lot of the public restrooms in Japan are still the porcelain hole in the ground is how you
Yeah.
go to the bathroom. And I had never experienced that prior to moving to Japan for a while. I'm used to, sitting on a commode, sitting on
We're
on a
from
seat.
sitting culture and they're from squatting culture.
Right, right. And so navigating that, it's hilarious trying to navigate that, as a first exposure, not prepared at all for it. Nobody tells you that that's what's there because it's not. We don't talk about hygiene, right? So it doesn't come up in conversation at all. So truly, it was like this immense culture shock walking to in a bathroom.
Yeah, I never thought about it before, but one of the things, if you study Japan, you learn that the use of bamboo is so important because of the scarcity of timber
Yeah.
and metal, right? That's the
Yep.
scarcity of timber and metal. And so we have the opposite issue in Europe, right? We got a
Right.
hell of timber and we got a hell of metal. So it's no big deal. I mean, if you look at a latrine in Viking England in the 800s, it's a bench with a hole in it over a hole. You're still
Right.
sitting, you're not
Right.
squatting,
Right. Yeah.
which is bizarre to me, but I mean, I just anyway, it's just really it's those whole I won't use those things. It's too disgusting.
Right. Exactly. Right. So yeah, so that's what I get into here. Using that as an example. So we in a lot of the other chapters we figure out how to navigate our environment. Right. This chapter is about how to prevent our environment from navigating us. It's kind of the reverse of everything we've talked about so far. We want to keep the tiny things we can't even see out of our system so they don't destroy us. Right. Now I like to use lessons like this. I present it in a very practical manner in the book about how to keep the pathogens out of your own system. But because hygiene's become so, I don't know, so enmeshed in our daily practices, it's not something that we actively think about anymore. We've allowed ourselves to drift away from being conscious of it as we interact with the entire world. So as we scale up our interactions, right? It's not just our interactions with the environment that hygiene is important. It's our interactions with each other that hygiene is important. It's interaction with ideas and concepts. It's interactions with different groups and different
Or
people
the
in different
entire
countries.
country of India.
Right. Right, exactly. Well, and that's the thing, like so much of this other stuff, you know, cultural norms play a big role in how you approach hygiene,
Yes.
and there's differences in there. And if you're not prepared for those differences, you risk exposing yourself in different ways to pathogens. True, but not just physical pathogens. We're talking about we're just we're not paying attention to hygiene in anything that we do anymore, right? It's just not part of
Is that
our thought process
wait,
anymore.
I just want to make sure that I understand. Because what I think about is before COVID, there were a couple of flus going around, and the South America had been previously not terribly careful about public spaces. And they realized very quickly how dirty South American public spaces were and how
Right.
big a deal it was. Of course, the Japanese, they take it to the nth degree, right? But okay, I get. I'm OCD, and I don't have
Right.
any of these problems because
Right.
I mean, I open doors with my elbow. I mean, everything.
Right. Exactly. Um, I do. This is the only chapter in the book where I make a Bible reference, and that's because there is you know, an actual part of the Bible in Deuteronomy where they talk about how to manage your waste. And to me, it's telling because it's part of our, it's all part of all living creatures' experience, right? We all, if you eat or
It's a
drink,
fun.
consume,
It's right up there with the Ten Commandments, right? I
right?
mean,
Yeah, but you have to know how to manage the waste products of being alive. It's just it's we've been talking about it even in book form, in print form, and in story form for thousands of years, right? So it's that significant. So that's kind of the introduction to hygiene and why I get into it here. In this section of the book, right? So we've covered a lot of how to gather resources from our environment, how to utilize the resources from our environment, how to keep ourselves alive from those resources, right? Now we want to make sure that we're not undermining any of those efforts, right? That's why hygiene falls where it does in the book, right? So we've taught you how to, we've rebuilt that foundation of how to sustain your life in your environment. So now the next step is let's make sure nothing is undermining that, right? So that's just why it falls into the flow of the book in this part or in this stage here.
Mm-hmm.
The first section I get into, I start talking about a plant-based chemical called tannins. It's actually a polyphenol that plants produce, right? It's bitter and it's astringent. If you've ever eaten unripe fruit, that bitter taste that you're tasting, those are tannins that are producing that flavor, that bitterness. Plants contain tannin. All plants produce tannins, but they contain them to fight off parasites and bacteria and viruses and fungi and stuff like that, right? It's the equivalent of a plant's white blood cell system or immune system, right? They also use it to prevent being eaten, right? So they want to be bad tasting. They want to be. That's why it's bitter. That's why it's astringent tasting, is because they don't want to be consumed, right? So tannins, for the frame of hygiene, are nature's sanitizer. It's like a naturally occurring sanitizer, and that's how we use it, and that's how I present it in the book. In this section about tannins, I do introduce the reader to some common high density tannin producing plants, some things that are readily available in most environments. Basically, one of the go-tos are hardwood trees. They're very rich in tannins in general.
Do you mean the wood or their leaves? What are you talking about?
Yeah, the wood, the leaves as well. The tannins are going to be found
Bark?
throughout the entire plant. The best thing to look for. Have you ever seen those like bulbous growths on trees?
Yes.
Right, they look kind of like a tree tumor, for
Because
lack
that's
of a
what they are.
better term. Well, that's exactly right. But what that represents is a virus or a bacteria was introduced to the tree, and it supercharged its tannin production in that spot. That's what that bulb is. It's called a gall. That's what
Yep.
that
Yep.
growth is called, is a gall. And a gall is super tannin rich because it was a growth in response to a pathogen. So it's a super concentration of tannin. So if you can find one of those, it's one of the best things to use if you're going to make your own, if you're trying to cultivate tannins or pull tannins out of a plant. But really, you can pull them from pretty much any plant part.
I
Extracting the
keep
tannins.
thinking, sorry.
But no, go ahead.
I guess one of the things that keeps coming to mind is when I'm listening to you talk about this stuff is the amount of time it takes to do everything. Right? It's just
Yeah.
so much. Like, I understand what you're talking about here. It's like, because I didn't learn this. I mean, I know this vaguely because I know about bark, right? But the amount of time it takes to make that stuff, right?
Right.
It's like the people who say, "Well, I'll just make penicillin at home."
Right.
You have no idea how
No
much
idea.
crap it takes to
Yeah.
make that penicillin enough.
Right.
Like, just for one person, for one dose, for one day, it's like an industrial process.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great, and that's why we want to be, especially with stuff like this, we want to be efficient with our actions, right? And it's a great point, because what are we doing here? We're pulling tree parts down for their tannins, right? But that at the same time, we could be acquiring the inner bark for cordage. We can be acquiring the wood itself to use in our fires, right? So we're trying to utilize as much of the plant that we're capturing as possible, and just like we try to utilize as much of the animals that we're capturing as possible. So we want to be efficient in our collection of resources, right? So, and that's kind of one of the things I'm trying to do here is I want people looking at not just, hey, that's a tree, but that tree represents cordage, it represents fire, it represents sanitizers, it represents food potentially. I mean, just changing how we perceive our environment, even, right? And that's some of the stuff plays back and forth between the field craft and the situational awareness stuff, right? They really,
it's sort of like people, the other white meat.
right, right. But as far as like you were talking about, how do we turn tannins into something usable, into a usable form, right? The tannins that are captured in plants or stored in plants, how do we extract that? And the method I use, or the method I offer in the book, is to make tannin tea. So you're going to take those tannin rich parts and you're going to boil them in water, right? And after you've reached the boiling point, making sure you're killing any any pathogens in the material that you've gathered, you're going to let it seep. And the longer you let it seep, the stronger it's going to be from a tannin standpoint, right? The more tannins are going to leach into the water, and it's going to get darker. It's going to go from a light brown to a dark brown, and that's how you know
Yeah.
your tannin tea is getting stronger. Now, once you've got the tannin tea, you can use it for everything because it truly acts like a sanitizer. It kills off fungus, it kills off viruses, it kills off bacteria, right? You can put your utensils in there to keep them clean. You can use it, you can make up some tannin tea and then take some of that and brew it with some mint leaves you found and add some charcoal into it and make a mouthwash out of it, things like that, right? So there's a lot you can do once you've brewed or extracted the tannin solution from the trees, right? So it also, because it acts like a sanitizer, you can kind of use it as an antiseptic. If you have cuts and bruises and stuff like that, you can rinse them and clean them with the tannin tea that you've made out of the plants, right? So there's a lot of uses once you have the material made. But like you said, it's a process of extraction. You no longer get to take for granted that it's available on a store shelf with a lot of this stuff, right? And we do a lot of taking for granted with a lot of stuff like this, specifically in this chapter. But once you know how to do this, you don't have to take that for granted anymore. That gets us back to the point where using the store is a choice, not a requirement, because you have the option of not knowing it. Just through sheer competence, you have the option of not using the store, right? And that's kind of one of my big goals, is to make sure that those conveniences stay choices, not become dependencies, right?
Yep.
All right, so then after tannins, the next one I introduce the reader to is saponins, right? And saponins are a glycoside, right? They're a sugar-based compound that forms inside plants as well. No, saponins, they're water soluble and fat soluble, right? And because of that, they act like a natural detergent.
What one have I
Combined with
used?
what's that?
What I've used one. I can't remember what it is. It's common.
Yeah, have you ever used like Conkers? The walnuts.
No, I haven't. That's a great
People,
one.
people used to make laundry soap, or they used to use those for laundry detergent all the time. You can pull them off the tree, smash them up, put them in a jar of water and shake it up. It gets all lathery and stuff like that. But like soapwort and yucca plants, they all have saponins in them. Things like, I mean, there's a lot of plants out there that have saponins in them, and
I was going
they're
to say, because
fantastic.
like I know that in medieval literature, they go through the plants that will produce soap. Right?
Yeah.
I've read the history of soap, which was very fascinating,
Right.
actually.
Yeah. So
And
the horse
the idea
chestnuts
that
is the one I was talking
Europeans
about. But
weren't clean, that's nonsense.
right, exactly. Yeah, it's just our surgery wasn't. Yes, things like soapberry, soap root. A lot of the strongest ones have soap in their name. Even licorice roots, English ivy, the leaves, right? That's pretty strong saponin. Um, so yeah, in the book, I do offer a list of the common saponin dense plants that you can find in a bunch of different environments as well. So if people are looking for that's in there as well. One of the cool things about saponins, if you can find like some of the ones that have the saponins in their leaves or in their roots and stuff like that, like the yucca or the ivy, you can actually, if you see them, or even soapberries is a great one. If you see them, you can pull them right off the plant and just rub them in your hands, and you'll get that foamy soapiness, that detergent soapiness to form just through rubbing them together like that. And that's it's going to bind with the oils in the waters, and you'll be able to rinse that off just like you rinse off a detergent from your hands. It works the
They're just
exact same way. It's the
natural.
same
They're
mechanism.
right. So the plants make their natural, what do you call antipathogens,
Yep.
right? And
Yeah. And the saponins are another one that they make for their own benefit, but we can extract and use for our benefit, right? So one of the best ways, and we talked about it a little bit already, one of the best ways of extracting saponins is to crush up or break apart the saponin rich portion of the plant, right? Like the chestnut or the root of the yucca plant or the leaves of the ivy, right? And then just agitate them in water. Get a vessel of water, that you can cover, you can hold your hand over, and just agitate them, and it'll produce that soapiness. It'll produce the suds, right? And then you can use that the same way you would use any kind of liquid soap. You can wash your dishes with it. You can wash your utensils with it. You can wash your body with it. You can wash your clothes with these saponins, right? So I mean,
and you
it
wash
becomes
your favorite friend
exactly
with it.
exactly. So between between tannins and saponins, we have detergent and we have antiseptics, right? We have sanitizers, right? So, and that's without any chemical factories. That's without any, grocery stores. That's without any access to anything else, but just the resources that are exist in our environments. So that said, let's move on. The next section, I move on to a slightly more complex process, right? Now, because we've already talked about how to capture small game and break it down, and we've already talked about how to make fire, we know how to identify ash from charcoal, right? The white versus the black. We can actually create lye from the ash, and we can render animal fat at this point. We have that capability just through using the lessons in the Primal Primer, right? And once we get to the point where we can create lye, we can render animal fat, we can make soap. We can make the same kind of soap
And
that
it's
sits
strong.
on, right, right, that sits on the counter
It's
in
hella
your
strong.
bedroom, right? Yeah. And so I call this field soap, right? Because it's soap
Yes.
you can make it in the field just using the lessons that we've already learned. And so I put a recipe in the book in the next section about field soap and how to make field soap and the process you go through to make it, right? I go over how to make the lye water, how to from the ash. I go over how to render the animal fat down, right? And it's a multi-step process, and then of course you let it sit for a while, and the longer you let it sit, the less caustic it's going to be and things like that, right? Because that's what releases from the material or tones down as it hardens, right? So you can start off with a real liquidy soap, and you can use that like a liquid soap, or you can let it harden to bars and then chop it up and use it like bar soap, right? You pour the final mixture into a shell or something that you find into that. Use that like as a soap mold, and you can make your own little shell soap like you see in grandma's bathroom, but it's in the field, right? But anyways, it's just a process for making soap out of the stuff that we've already learned in the book, right? Which I think is pretty cool, right? We're taking lessons from other chapters and applying them in this chapter to make something that we just take for granted now in the form of soap. So after the field soap instruction, the next section is about additional hygiene materials, right? And this is where we start to get into some alternatives that we don't use a lot in our normal day-to-day life, right? So one of my favorites, and I use it all over the place. We use it in water, we use it in everything else, is charcoal. It's a great resource to use for keeping yourself clean or keeping bacteria away, right? um you can crush it up, you can gargle with it. Like I said, when we were talking about the tea, the mouthwash tea, you can brush with charcoal just like it's toothpaste. You want to make sure it's really fine. You don't want it gritty because you don't want to be wearing your teeth your tooth enamel down, right? But you can use it. There's a lot of toothpaste even being made now with activated charcoal in it, right? That's all they're doing is they're just crushing up charcoal and putting it into the paste, right? You can do it. You can use it the exact same way. You can rub charcoal onto your armpits and stuff and use it like a natural deodorant, right? I mean, it has deodorant properties as well. So charcoal is fantastic stuff for hygiene, in addition to being fantastic for water filters and for helping to make fire and things like that. So charcoal is a very useful material when it comes to keeping yourself alive once you get a handle on how to make it. Another thing that we can use, and it's been used by people throughout history, is smoke. People have been taking smoke baths for you can find those on every continent that had people living on them is taking smoke baths, right? So I get introduce the reader to smoke baths in here. You can do it with your clothes on to help deodorize and kill bacteria in your clothes, and you can do it with your clothes off to help kill bacteria and deodorize your body. Now you're going to smell like smoke, but it's better than smelling like stink. So, right?
Most of us have smelled like smoke through most of our history, right?
Right, exactly. And this
I
is
have a
yeah.
well, anyway.
So we talk about, so in other chapters, I talk about fire being a force multiplier. It acts that same way here because we can use it to produce smoke. We can use that smoke to do the sun baths. One of just the easiest things to do is be in that direct sunlight, right?
Yeah.
That the ultraviolet rays from the sun, they kill bacteria. It's a great thing to expose yourself to, right? So in addition to things like raising your vitamin D levels and which improves your immune response and things like that, but just getting out in some actual sun, right? If your threat conditions allow, do some nude sunbathing, right? Kill the bacteria on your body. Let the sun get in all the nooks and crannies, right? I mean, just that it's
Well,
just
my neighbors might object.
well,
I don't have a problem with it, but
if you're the one keeping them alive anyways, because you have all these skills, they don't get to
I guess
object too
so. Yeah,
strongly,
you get a lot with a lot that way. Sure.
right? I also in this section about alternative hygiene methods, I walk the reader how to make their own toothbrush from softer woods, right? You chew up the end, so it gets bristly. Like they can use that to rub on your teeth. You can do the same thing if you find a Y-shaped branch. You do it on the inside of one of the Ys, so you can get the back of your teeth, right? I mean, it's just stuff like that, right? So we go over that in this section, and then I finish this section under additional hygiene materials, just talking a little bit about things like wild leeks and onions, right? And if you can squeeze the wild leeks and the wild onions, you get that oil out of them. And that oil acts as is a mild, but it acts as a mild insect repellent, right? So the chiggers and the mites and stuff that would otherwise be infesting you as you neglect your hygiene, this can help keep them at bay until you get a chance to implement some of these practices and start getting your hygiene back in shape. So that's kind of the first part of the chapter where I talk about keeping yourself clean, right? So the next section of the chapter, we actually start getting into the bodily functions and how do we manage and navigate the bodily
Oh, no.
functions.
I'm really afraid of this.
So this section is called Eats, Poops, and Leaves, right?
That's like that's the eat, shoots, and leaves is the test of the comma.
Right.
Eats, shoots, and leaves, and so you've
Yeah.
converted very. Was that you or was that your helper there that came up with that? That must have
Well,
been.
we worked together on this one because it has
That
a few
was
different meanings in here. So
yeah. Can I just like wear my headphones for this part? I'm a conservative. I have a terrible disgust response, but anyway,
yeah,
let's go ahead.
yeah, it's funny. But yeah, so just like just like waste is unavoidable to survive, talking about it is unavoidable when we talk about how to survive, right? So I have to do it in the book, and that means we have to have this conversation about it. So um in this section, I really start to introduce the reader. Prior to this, it was all just instruction. And I kept it strictly on, here's how you do X, here's how you do Y, here's how you do Z. These are the steps you take. This is when I start getting a little bit more into the concepts behind hygiene and why hygiene is important, right? Because that poor hygiene can have a domino effect. Right?
Absolutely.
So it's going to start weakening you. It's going to start undermining you, right? It's going to start interfering with your ability to do all the other things you need to do to keep yourself alive, right? Things like feeding yourself, getting enough water, protecting yourself from more immediate threats, right? Whether it's other people or it's animals or any of those kind of things. If you don't have a handle on your hygiene, then those kind of things are going to start being compromised by the effects of that poor hygiene, right? It's just going to start deteriorating your system, right? It's going to negatively impact all of the tools you've developed up to this point, right? If you're not taking care of yourself and you're not taking care of those, right? So hygiene is about not just keeping your body in a state of cleanliness. It's about keeping the environment that you're in a state of cleanliness as well, right? You don't want to be pooping where you eat, things like that, right? And so I started talking about those
Or
concepts
near where
in
your
this
water comes
section,
from.
right? Exactly, in this section of the book, right? And that's actually one of the things we use. People they want to piss into the river, right? Because it sends it downstream, right? Just make sure if you're going to do that, you're pissing downstream from where you pull water out, your own water out for drinking or eating or whatever, cooking or whatever you're doing, right? And actually, there's actually a series that you want to use when you're setting up your water system, where you're pulling, your drinkable, your potable water first. The next one is where you wash your eating utensils. The next one down from that is where you wash your clothing. The next one down from that is where you wash your body. The next one down from that is where you start, doing your waste removal or elimination and stuff like that, right? So there's actually a sequence you use if you're near running water to ensure you're not contaminating yourself in the process of that.
You learn if you learn anything about digging wells, you learn how amazing the earth is at
Yeah,
filtering.
yeah,
And it just doesn't make any sense to ever pollute any water anywhere ever. It just doesn't. It's ridiculous.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and we talked a lot about that in the water section, right? I'm a big fan of using, you filter pits to
Yeah.
filter out water. I mean, you
Yeah.
can even filter out seawater doing things like that. So it's fantastic. Um, where to go? So that's the next section in Eats, Poops, and Leaves. And then here I actually go into detail about where to build your latrine pit, how to make it so walking into it, where to position it in regard to your camp and stuff like that. So it's an actual field guide on where to do your business. When you're out away from the toilets. Right. So and I go into as much detail as I can about how to set that up. Um, the next section is about urine, and this one is a big one. Don't hold hold it when you're out in a situation where you're trying to keep yourself alive. You don't want to be holding your urine. If you have the urge to go, you need to go pee, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to create that warm, wet ideal condition for bacteria to start growing. You don't want to have that in your system. The other side of it is if you're holding it, you're internally you're telling your system that you have liquid in your system, and it's going to slow down your thirst response. It's going to slow down your body's read of I need to introduce more water into my system, and you run the risk of really getting yourself dehydrated a lot faster if you're holding your pee. Right, so you want to get that out of your system. You want to flush that out of your system. You want to get all that waste out of your system so that your body's sending accurate signals saying, hey, we need to go get more water. We need to keep flushing stuff through. We need to go get more water, right? You don't want to miss dehydration signals when you're in a situation where you're keeping yourself alive. And one of the things people do to get themselves into trouble is they hold it when they got to pee. That's just, it's a bad habit. um, so after urine, I talk about feces, right? Dig a hole. That's that's the big takeaway from feces. Dig a hole away from everything else. When you're done, cover it up. Don't leave it just lying open. You don't want to attract animals. You don't want to step in it later. You don't want anything to happen. Dig a hole, go. When you're done, fill it back in. It's that simple. There's a lot of techniques you could use. There's a lot of other things that could go into it. But if you get those simple steps, you're mostly gonna be okay. And of course, some of the other things that are helpful here after you've gone to the bathroom is you have, your tannin tea ready. You have some saponins available, or you've made soap, right? After you go to the bathroom, after you eliminate waste, after you take a dump, clean yourself up, right? Especially your hands. Your hands are what's moving everything else into and out of your system. So wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. This next one here,
Mommy was right.
What's that?
Mommy was right.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The next section is, what to wipe with. Right, you've gone to the bathroom. Now we gotta wipe things off, wipe the waste off, right? And it's funny saying it, but I have to make sure I say it in here. Don't use sharp, pointy things to wipe with.
What the? You gotta okay, I just don't understand. Is that like really a thing?
It's not. It's not that I think people are going to be, using like an actual sharpened stick.
You wouldn't have said it unless it came up somewhere because somebody did it.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is they'll see a branch that's got leaves all over it, and they're not paying close attention what the branch itself looks like, and they start using this branch of leaves to try to wipe themselves down, not realizing that all the burrs and stuff on the branch are tearing holes in their skin. And so now instead of cleaning themselves off, they've introduced additional pathways for pathogens to enter their system, and put it in close proximity to where those pathogens are most likely to occur, right? And so you really want to be careful about what you wipe. And I offer, a bunch of suggestions in the book about what to use, right? But the big thing is you don't want to disturb the barrier between your bloodstream and your waste, right? You don't ever want to do that. You don't want to tear yourself open while you're going to the bathroom, right? So don't use things that are super rough. Don't use things that are, that have thorns on them, even by mistake. Check first, right? Use the leaves if you can find them. Make sure you're not using, poison ivy, poison oak, something that's going to create a bigger problem when you use it, right? But you use something to wipe with. You're better off if you're not sure if the thing you're going to wipe with is dangerous to you or not. You're better off wiping with your bare hand and washing up really well afterwards than you are using the unknown leaf or stick or thorny branch or something like that. And the same thing applies, for the women when you're wiping,
right? Jesus. For women, it's a nightmare.
Right. But because when we're talking about urine versus feces, you can do things like tapping off and things like that you can't do when you have to physically wipe the matter off, right? We're talking about a liquid versus a solid, right? So there's more options that you have. But I also talk about things in here because we've already introduced the ability to make tannins, to make saponin and stuff. We can clean cloths that we use. So you can set aside a cloth that you have as a reusable cloth, and you can clean it using the tannins and the saponins and things like that. And so that those other things, and the reason I introduce them in these steps is because those give us more options. They open up more options to us in addressing this specific issue of what to wipe with. So I spend a decent amount of time in the book talking about what do you wipe with, right?
So
Because
now before this, I realize you had to suffer to write this book.
yeah, it was not.
Right.
This is not my favorite chapter to work on.
This is not fun. I'm sorry.
Like you, I have a pretty healthy disgust response, and I
Yeah.
don't even like thinking about any of this. It's
No.
part of it. But I also have children that are boys and girls, and I have to
Yeah.
be able to
Yeah.
address this
Yeah.
stuff with my own
Yeah.
kids, and
Yeah.
I have my own needs, and I have to make sure my wife is being taken care of, because that's the other side of it as well. That the reusable cloth thing I talk about for wiping with, that same thing applies for menstrual cycles and stuff like that. We can use those same
Absolutely.
kind of concepts, right? But we have to be conscious of that. We have to be aware of that. We have to account for that in our competence, in our foundational competence, right? I mean, our ancestors were doing this long before there was convenience stores, long before there was the products that we have available now. People were using absorbent mosses and things like that as diapers. They were using absorbent
Yeah.
mosses for hygiene products and things like that, and they're using natural sponges and things like that. And so those things are out there, and we can survive with them, or we wouldn't exist, because that's what our ancestors used. So I'm just trying to bring some of that back onto people's radar and say, one of my big breaking points, one of my big motivations for actually sitting down and turning all of this stuff into a book, was that this idiotic, insane panic around toilet paper when the pandemic hit. I mean, that was one of my, oh crap, we have gone so far away from being human that we're actually freaked out because we can't walk into a store and get something to help us wipe our rear ends.
Yeah. I was
And that
kind of
was, and
myself.
that had people in panic mode. That's not a human reaction. Being panicked about toilet paper is not a human reaction. And so that was one of my big, I have to address all of this now. I can't let it go anymore. I can't clean
Yeah.
up clean up the material, but I have to launch something that addresses this now, because oh my God. So, so that's why I spent some time in here. That's why it was important to me to spend some time in here on what to wipe with. That was a motivating factor in the book's existence in the first place. So,
Too bizarre.
we lost our minds about what to wipe with. So
Hey, you've really screwed me up with this whole thing, because this whole I was talking to somebody in, I thought it was our last one of our chats. It was either a staff chat or one with Brad. And I was talking about how you had to, when I went to, we've done the Boy Scout thing, but you just did that stuff because there's nothing else to do, right? Except, so the whole how to do stuff thing was really common. I told you the story about being in second grade and fixing the sink in the back of the room, right? I mean, it was like, okay, well, just because you're just observing, right?
right.
Well, it's the same thing. I was talking about being in art school. It's like, well, I know how to cast bronze. I know how to carve stone. I know how to cast wax. I know how to, do clay and make clay mold. I mean, I know how to do a lithograph and I'll make ice, make ink and press them and make paper and I know how to make oil paints and I know how to charcoal and all. I mean, I know all this stuff and how to do all these things. I know how to do draft. I know how to use drafting pens and pencils and compasses and all this other stuff. And yeah, I'm thinking about this stuff, and I'm like, and I always say, well, you fix. I used to fix my own car, right? I mean, it was cheaper, but it was also kind of fun,
Right.
right? And so
And you knew it was done right.
That part I'm never sure about, but it seemed to be okay. But anyway, so you do all these things, and you realize that this accumulation of competencies that you take for granted. Like you're talking about taking shampoo and soap and toilet paper for granted, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't take them for granted, but because I went to the same, I learned how to go to the woods and dig a hole, and
Right.
because you had a spade and you had your backpack, and that's how you did things, right? It wasn't a miracle, and you had a little bar of soap and you had a little flat thing. You went down to the water and you washed your hands, right? I learned a. But what you're creeping me out with is this whole process is the awareness of that stuff isn't common.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And so it's like there's this crunching happen between the failures of human competency, the collapse of education, and then both are being constrained by the decline in IQ.
Yes.
And it's did you terrify yourself as much as I'm terrified
Yeah,
by doing this work?
it landed on me like a physical blow once it finally clicked that this is what was going on here. I mean, it's truly it's disturbing to notice, to observe, to see. Right.
They're worried about AI, which I think is ridiculous.
Right.
And I'm sitting here, you people, you can't. You're afraid of toilet paper. I mean,
Right.
it's just what the hell. I mean, I don't in this place, but usually I have a bidet.
Right.
Right, it's like the water works just fine. A cloth
Right.
and water works just fine.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it was it was a challenging thing to navigate. It was a challenging thing to realize I was seeing something accurately. I kept trying to find a way to disbelieve what I was seeing and to think,
Right, you
there's got
think
to be
I
something.
must be obsessed with something or
Yeah, I
something.
got it. There's got to be something wrong. I'm interpreting something wrong. I'm
Right,
not reading this the right way. And then, so I kept digging, right? And I mean, I probably spent 5 years longer digging than I needed to on figuring this part
right,
out,
right, right.
right? Because I mean, because we talked about before, with my kids being all these different generations, I'm seeing this thing get worse and worse and worse with each of my kids' generations and the people they're interacting with and the culture they're interacting with and the media they're interacting with. I'm seeing this problem get not just persist, but get worse. The
Getting
separation
worse,
from
right?
being
And it's
competent
worse within
humans.
your visible lifetime.
Yes, yeah. And so it's like, what is there? What is that? What is the problem? And it can't be this. It can't be what we're
And I
talking
keep
about.
you talk to you talk to Gen Z, right?
Yeah.
Which is between absolutely useless, crazy, screwed up, and at least cogently aware that something's not right.
Yes.
Right. So I have some hope that the ones that are cogently aware that something's not right, but it makes me aware, as a person who studied institutions my whole life, right? Even normative, behavioral, linguistic, all this other stuff, you
Yeah.
become aware that those people, like the people who aren't like predisposed to think about how the world actually works, decompose it, and figure out how to become competent in it. Those people they're just running on imitation,
Yeah.
no
And
understanding,
imitation and momentum.
and they
That's
have
what they
no
keep doing.
understanding. And
Yeah.
when they think they do, they're wrong,
Right.
right? And they get overconfident about it, and
Right.
it's like it's terrifying.
Well, then they start designing policy around that incompetence.
Well, you could
You have
argue we call it infantilization, but you could also call it institutionalized incompetence, right?
yeah, it's institutionalized incompetence. Yeah, but it emerges from that infantilization. But once they start systematizing that infantilization, it becomes institutional incompetence.
Right, right, right.
And that's, in a lot of ways, that's where we are now.
Don't we have enough? We've like taken on this amazing. This our group has taken on this amazing burden. Right?
Right.
We're not getting paid for this.
I wish somebody else would have seen this part so that I didn't have to do it.
Right. Exactly.
I mean,
I'd rather,
I love working with people, and I love,
sure,
working with this
sure.
kind of stuff. But I first of all, I don't want this to be a problem. I never wanted to see this as a problem. I never wanted this to
Yes.
be the problem that emerged. It's
Right.
terrifying and terrible that this is a problem that has to be solved. But I, I'm not, I'm not I wasn't a prepper going into learning this stuff. I wasn't a prepper going into putting this material together. I'm a humanist. I have these skills. I have the skill set, but it wasn't because I have a basement full of food that I'm going to ride out the zombie apocalypse with. That's not my hobby. That wasn't what fueled me. But I kept seeing this problem emerge and become more and more clear, and the underlying cause of it becoming less and less hard, or more and more hard to argue against, less and less avoidable in my exploration of it. And it's like, oh man, I got to solve that. I don't want to. I don't want to solve
Exactly.
that. So yeah, But the nice thing is that because of that imitation piece, what we need to do is we need to find the right 100 monkeys.
No, well, that's what we're doing, right?
Right. So I'd love for everybody on the planet, that doesn't have this stuff already, to read the book, so they at least have that basic level of foundational competence, that core human competence that I talk about all the time. I would love that, because what a simple way to get there, right? I think, right? You read a 200-page book and practice the things a few times, and you've basically restored hundreds of generations of human development, right?
We need the equivalent of the Boy Scouts for your book.
Right, right.
Right. The Boy Scouts
So,
and the Boy Scouts for you.
right. And you know, I worked really hard in this stuff to reduce it down to the minimum requirements of competence, right? So this isn't an exhaustive book. It was never designed to be an exhaustive book. My goal was the minimum set of competencies required to be a human again, right? To not be a pet of other humans,
Well,
but to
you
be your
said
own
it like
human.
it's the Maslowian pyramid,
Yeah,
and the I guess one of the things that I've been sort of pondering, which is the problem facing humanity, is I always talk about the arc from embodiment to anthropomorphism to philosophy, theology, philosophy, science,
yeah,
logic, and computation, right? I mean, we go through this huge arc. Well, that's a lot of shit. I mean, you can't understand this without understanding this,
yes,
right? It's a lot. Well, it's just the same thing for most people. Is you can't it's pretty hard to understand some of the complex stuff we do, right? But if you're going to skip all this stuff, because you start forgetting, and
yes,
you end up with this thing we find in history. The place where it annoys me the most is computer science, where every generation tries to reinvent the dumbest fucking possible thing that's been that every generation has known
yeah,
for the past million years,
yeah,
and every generation feels like, oh, it's like there's a new programming language or something. I'm like, you're a fucking idiot,
right,
right? I
right,
mean, there's only three ways of doing things. It's these three ways, and everything else is basically, can we get away with it with the hardware that's available today,
right,
right? I mean, and can we do it? And then the other side is, can we make it so that it's simpler for a human being to flip all those switches through a compiler or something to make
right,
that happen? But
right.
fundamentally, there's three ways of doing things, and that's it,
Yes,
right? So it's just, I'm thinking about you and your Maslowian hierarchy pyramid. There's a tendency for people to want to just keep their knowledge
yeah,
in some sort of radius, as if that's all that's necessary.
right,
And it's like, well, if you want to be completely irresponsible and not have any say anything, okay, fine. But somebody's got to eventually be responsible for understanding the stack,
right.
right? And being able to make sure that we can under good circumstances we can rise, and under bad circumstances we can fall. And when we have a bad circumstance and you think it's not even bad, and you think toilet paper is a fucking crisis, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, you're definitely not standing on the stack. You're just floating somewhere.
Well, I wouldn't mind if they would just, what you call it, just shut up.
Right.
Well, that was Brandon said that earlier today.
Yeah.
I confuse sometimes I confuse your mutually shared sarcasm.
Right. But the
But
thing,
the problem,
if you just want to ride along, don't try to steer.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's
So you didn't finish my favorite part, which is diarrhea.
yeah, diarrhea, right? So other dangers, right? And we talked about this a little bit throughout, but it's really important. And I finished the chapter on this because it's such a huge
Because it's the
concern.
exit point of the chapter.
Yeah, it's the exit point. This is where it all flushes out. Um, so diarrhea is a big one, right? Diarrhea, that's why I don't know if you ever played Oregon Trail when you were a kid on the old black and green computer screens, right? And things like that. Everybody would get dysentery and die because that was a
Yeah.
real thing.
No,
That wasn't,
that's true.
and it wasn't because dysentery was a deadly virus. It was because dysentery gave you diarrhea, which sapped your energy and made you dehydrated, and
Right.
so you died. Right, and that same thing is true. So much of what we look at, when we're navigating an unfamiliar environment, is a diarrhea risk. You eat the wrong thing, you're going to get diarrhea. You interact with the wrong thing, you're going to get diarrhea.
Dysentery's killed more people, more people in war than pointy objects ever have.
Right. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is absolutely dangerous as hell.
Right. But that's what makes it dangerous, is because it compromises everything else. It undermines all your other systems. Right. And so, I mean, it's just the dehydration is a terrible thing to be confronting when you're trying to keep yourself alive, when you're already stressed because you have to turn your entire system to sustaining life. Right.
Yeah.
You don't want to introduce an additional stress of dehydration or the additional stress of diarrhea. Right. And it's not just pathogens that do that. If you eat not even poisonous foods, but unfamiliar foods in enough quantities,
Yes.
you're gonna start vomiting. You're gonna start getting diarrhea, right? So I mean, all of this stuff ties together. It in any situation where you need your competence to survive, you can't afford to have your body turning on you. You can't afford to turn yourself into the weak link in your survival chain. And that's what this stuff does.
I
That's
have
what poor
I
hygiene
have traveled the world and I have never had this problem because I'm effing paranoid.
does. Right. You're fastidious about hygiene.
Absolutely effing paranoid. It's
Yeah.
not
And that's
me. I
the
don't want to touch it.
right.
Me, I'm questionable, right? You know,
Yeah, and that's kind of what I want, readers taking away from this. You don't want to be fighting a virus when you have to fight an attacker. That's a terrible position to be in. That means you're already compromised,
and it
right?
takes you out for a while.
Yeah,
Like you
yeah,
can run out of food and water.
yep. Well, that's
Right,
the thing. That's the cascade effect of poor hygiene. Is it makes everything that can kill you much more likely to do so,
right,
and
right.
increases the speed at which it can do so.
Yeah.
Right. So where tools are our force multiplier, poor hygiene is all of nature's threats is the force multiplier for them against you.
What you're saying is partly that the fact that we don't like to talk about it is part of the problem.
The fact that we don't like talking about it is part of the problem. Yeah, and it's not just a physical problem either, right? We don't want to talk about it, so we don't see, the social pathogens because we're not talking about any pathogen. We're not talking about the risks of any pathogen, so we don't see the compromising um, ideology as a risk to our long term survivability. Just like we don't see, the way we're wiping our butts as a potential risk to our long term survivability. We're just not hygiene's not on our radar enough anymore because we've accounted for it so much in our conveniences, right? We don't maintain a competence of hygiene any longer. We just go through the motions of it. We just follow. We just what were we saying before? We just mimic. We
Imitate.
yeah, we imitate, right? We're not actually expressing a competence of it. We're just imitating it. We're doing the practice of it, but we're not aware of it. We're not thinking of it. We're not interacting with the world with a mindfulness of hygiene, right? And whether that's physical hygiene, whether that's
That's
social
really, I
hygiene, whether
didn't
it's
think about,
cultural hygiene.
I didn't, we should, that's actually a great demonstrated interest.
Yeah,
You know, I didn't think about going into that. We probably
yeah,
should cover that.
yeah, probably.
Hygiene is a demonstrated interest. That's
Yes,
smart
yeah,
because it really is, right?
yeah. It
Shit,
really is. Yeah,
I just cursed with the proper word too. Shit, but I mean, we that's really true, right? Because
yeah,
we talk about um uh impositions about the demonstrated of interest each other through the institutional, informal, formal means. We talk
yeah.
about it, but we don't talk about it from the self on your own hygiene.
Right. Yeah. Well, and
That's
if we use body as the mechanism, which is performing the hygiene or which hygiene is performing against, right? That we have our own body, we have our group's body, we have our political body, we have our community body, we have all of these,
yeah.
we have our national body. All of these things require hygiene to prevent the undermining of.
Walk this path. This is very useful.
So, so
Um,
that's kind of that's one of the reasons I frame the end of the chapter the way I frame it is because I want people thinking, in that hygiene mindfulness. I want that to be integrated, right? We talked a little bit about, the imitation and stuff. I believe that there's a place in the middle between conservative and progressive, and I call that place integration, right? And
yeah,
that's how we move forward. We don't, we integrate all this, and that's what we're not doing. We talk about that the people that are not on the stack, right? They're above the stack somewhere. Those people aren't integrating all of the previous lessons into their existence, right? It's a failure of integration, and that's what we've lost here is that integration of everything that's came before, whether it's in our technology or whether it's in our our norms or whether it's in our evolved practices. We're no longer we're so disconnected that we can't perform that integration piece, right? And that's kind of what I'm trying to restore is we have to have that foundation from which to integrate all of these things, and it's across all scales. It's across all human dynamics. We want to maintain that integration. Integration is the key. We're not trying to conserve anything. We're not trying to progress away from nature's feedback. We're not trying to regress back into nature's feedback. We're trying to integrate nature's feedback into all of our forward movement,
mhm.
right? And that's kind of that's my drive through all of this is we have to know all this stuff so that we can integrate it. Like I've said in a lot of other chapters, I'm not recommending people go spend all their time out in the woods and that's where they do go to the bathroom every time they go to the bathroom. That's not my point here. I don't want people running through the woods going to the bathroom. I want you to know how to, so that you can integrate that into everything we do moving forward. So you can integrate these hygiene practices, the competence of the hygiene practice, into how we handle all of our hygiene across all domains moving forward.
So okay, so have you achieved what you wanted to achieve talking about this chapter?
Yeah.
It
went
was
through a lot of
way
crap.
better, way more interesting, and way less disgusting than I thought.
Right. Yeah. There's more discussing things in the book, so people are disappointed by the level of discuss.
We're not
I go into
discussing.
more detail about a lot of it in the book, so read the chapter. But
Well, thank you for saving me, the audience. So if you got everything across that you wanted to.
yep, I got everything across. That I
Okay,
wanted to get
chapters
across.
13. Now we've only got 3 more, right?
There's 3 more chapters to go after this. Yeah.
What are they?
So we go into let me look up real quick.
You have to look it up now. You're the
Yeah.
author.
Well,
I do this too.
so the chapter 14 is we go through end to end on situation awareness, right? So I introduced the concept, then I
Review.
introduced each of the tool sets, or the pieces of situation awareness. Chapter 14 is putting them all together into a cohesive package that you use, a cohesive practice that you use. After that, I go into fear, managing fear, right? Because one of the big things that happens as you start learning a lot of this stuff is, before you become practiced at it, right? When you're just starting to develop it, suddenly you're more aware of all the threats around you, more aware than you've ever been before. And very reasonably, that's going to produce fear and anxiety in you. And how do you manage that? How do you walk through that? What does that actually mean? What are you actually interacting with when you're looking at fear? Right. And so I spend chapter 15 on fear and how to walk through that fear as you develop the competence. Right. Let's leverage that fear.
I had to get therapy because I don't have enough fear.
Right. Right.
What?
And then chapter 16 is the closing chapter, right? It's where I revisit the initial 2 chapters where I state the theory and the hypothesis, and then how I'm describing the theory hypothesis, and then it's my conclusion about what it means and why I'm presenting all the material the way I presented it. So
summary, fear, conclusion.
Yep.
Why is fear there?
Because
why is fear there instead of the beginning?
Right. And I don't want fear to be, that's the point of the fear chapter as well. I don't want fear to get in the way of developing the competencies.
There we go.
And so it's one of the questions I get frequently when I'm presenting this material. People is like, all right, so before today, I wasn't paying attention to any of this stuff. Now I'm paying attention to this stuff, and it's all making me scared. It's like, okay, so let's address the fear. I'm paraphrasing.
No, okay. I'm not normal. I get it. So okay. And then 16 again is where
it's the conclusion. It's where I wrap everything up together and say, I started with this, was telling you about this problem that I'm seeing, and at the end I say, now we've covered all the ways that we can address that problem.
Do you think people understand? I mean, I've asked this question. I keep asking it because what I've learned from your work is more profound than what I thought when I started it. Yeah. Right. And so do you think people will understand that profound?
If I did my job right, they don't need to. They get to the end of it, and if they practice the skills and they do the work that I asked them to do in the book,
they'll be it rather than need. They don't need to understand it.
Right. They won't need to know how profound it is. They will gain the benefit of that foundation, and that will set them up for future recognition of new profundity. I don't know to recognize what is profound moving from there. They can integrate from there. Right.
I don't like to distract from your book, unless I'm trying to add humor to. Right.
No, it's good. It's good.
So, but I have a curiosity that we can cut out or not if you want to, because we normally for right now would say, show me your book and whatever. But so the fear thing is interesting. When I look at our friend Noah's work, and his thing is getting control of emotions. Mm-hmm. Is there any real difference?
So the way I present it, there's 2 elements at play, and I think he's absolutely correct. But first, you have to identify: is it an emotion, which means is it a response to a stimulus, or is it a projection? And most of what I'm talking about is a projection. So you're not even at the stage of emotion yet. Like the acronym I use in the book, and we'll go into more depth when we get there. It's fear is an acronym for false evidence appearing real.
Yes.
And so you're projecting what your expectation on a situation rather than reading the signals of the situation. And so Noah's work teaches you to receive the signal and appropriately respond to the signal. That is an emotional response, and that is you managing and navigating your emotional response. What we're doing is we're not even talking about the signal yet. We're talking about our expectation of what the signal is going to be or might be. And so we're not even at the point. We're self-stimulating a false emotion at that point.
Right.
And so we have to make that identification first.
So that's why I like your work. It's like my whole thing. Can we get to the point where we're built the Maslowian pyramid, right? And we're making people competent by design instead of by accident.
Yes, we absolutely can.
And I see what you're doing, right? Is by design, and what I want out of Stoicism or whatever religion is to do the same thing, because you the reason you have to get to a therapist like Noah is because you didn't get the competency along the way.
Yes.
And what you're trying to do is provide that competency.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. So now, can I close now?
We can close.
Let's have the book again, the Primal Primer. Where can you get it?
All online booksellers, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. Amazon's the best place to get it. They have all versions of it. I also am on Gumroad. If you want, audiobook or you want video book, I have it available on Gumroad as well. All the links are through the website. They're all online and everything, so they're all over the place.
And the website
I do have an ask for people that have read it. Please leave, if you're on Amazon particularly, leave a response. Give me some feedback. It plays really well into Amazon's algorithm. The more feedback you have, the more viewer reviews you have, the better. Be honest. I'm not asking for 5-star reviews. I want actual feedback. I don't want you to lie about the book. I just want more of it. And I can't, as I revise it and as I make changes to it and how I present it and how I work with people, it helps me get better at that if I get feedback from the people reading the material. So that's my big ask is if you picked it up and read it, let me know how it works for you. So.
All right. Love you, man. See you next week. We'll do chapter 14. Looking forward to it. Always enjoy talking. Bye-bye.